Greetings, everyone. I'm Melissa Meeks, and I'm the Director of Professional Development for Eli Review, and I'm delighted that you're participating in our showcase across disciplines. Eli Review, for those of you who are new to our app, and we have a couple of people who are new, is developed by instructors at Michigan State University to support the effective peer feedback and critical thinking. And the app is really straightforward. Students submit a little piece of writing or a long piece of writing, whatever you ask them to turn in, and then they give each other feedback using questions that you've designed. Then, because of the way the questions are formatted, you get trends and analyses that you can use to talk to your students about what happened in peer review. So it gives you a coaching role in the feedback that students are exchanging. And some instructors go on to assign a revision plan, which is a low-stakes way of holding students accountable for using the peer feedback that they've received. The idea behind Eli is that you'll do this as often as possible to increase students' engagement in peer feedback and revision planning. And so I'm delighted today to welcome Brian Larson from Texas A&M. Brian is a longtime Eli user, and he's going to share with you one of the reviews that he's assigned and talk about it. But the reason we're focusing on review task design is because students learn a lot from giving feedback. On our team, Bill Hart-Davidson calls that giver's gain. But the giver's gain begins with how you ask students to talk to each other about their work in progress. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Brian can share his and tell us a little bit about the course he teaches and the writing task and review he's sharing.
Excellent. Thanks, Melissa. Let me see if I can get the sharing thing to work the way it ought. Oh dear. Hold on a second. Share. I think that should give you an Eli review screen that says review task PR of practice memo A. Is that what everyone sees?
Perfect. Yes.
Good. Okay. So the course that I'm talking about here is Legal Analysis, Research, and Writing 1. This is a required 3-credit course for all first semester law students at Texas A&M University School of Law. And this assignment calls for students to write 1 or 2 paragraphs, usually 2, presenting a very simple rule-based legal analysis using what we call the CREAC organizational paradigm. And I'll point out what the pieces of that mean in just a moment. I present the students with a hypothetical problem. It's a couple paragraphs about a hypothetical client situation. And then I present them with a statutory rule that they need to apply to resolve that legal problem, and also an excerpt of a made-up court opinion that helps them understand that statutory rule a little bit. So students perform this assignment at the end of the first or the beginning of the second week of the semester. So it's very early in their training. And rule-based reasoning is one of the first things that we take up, so that in the law, you can also have analogical reasoning and policy-based reasoning, which I think are more advanced skills, but we start with the rule-based reasoning because they come closest to the deductive syllogism, which most students at least have had some exposure to. The students submit the writing, and then they get a day or 2 to do the peer review. So they usually review 3 other students' performances. And then the day after the peer review is finished, we have a class session where we do the debriefing. So students know in advance when they're doing this assignment and giving each other peer reviews that they will have to submit a revised version of this assignment, which I will grade. But this particular, these particular tasks, the writing and peer review tasks we're talking about here today, are graded as completion grades. You get the points if you do them.
That's really helpful, Brian. So let me just say back that the writing task lets students know the kinds of things you're going to ask them in the peer review. So could you sort of walk us through this review task and how you think it sets these first-year law students up for success in giving feedback on CREAC?
Sure. So this review task, so the page you're seeing here looks a bit like what the students would see looking at another student's writing sample. Here, over on the left, where you've got Catherine Janeway's writing, this is where they'd actually see the other students writing. And then you have these two panels of trait identification. And I use only trait identifications in this particular assignment. That isn't always true, but I do here. And the CREAC organizational paradigm calls on the writer to state the conclusion of their analysis at the beginning and at its end, to tell us what legal rule governs the analysis, to explain that rule if necessary, and then to apply that rule to the facts of their client's problem or the facts of the legal situation. And the CREAC components are described in the textbook. So that's in section 10.2. And then there's a different set of trait identifications for writing the rule. So this early assignment tests students on whether they use the CREAC paradigm, but it's focused in more on how they write a legal rule, because that's something that law students will be doing, well, for the rest of their careers, probably for their lives. And the technique for doing that is described in the textbook on section 10.3. And this is an open access textbook, by the way. So if you reach out to Melissa and ask her, I'll give you a link where you can get access to the textbook if you want to. But I mean, I'm not saying it's any good. It's just what I happen to use because it does the things I want it to do, unlike the other textbooks that are out there. With regard to CREAC, for instance, it asks really straightforwardly, did your peer begin and end their analysis with a conclusion statement? Because that's what you do in CREAC. Did your peer state the rule after the initial conclusion? Did your peer explain the rule with reference to the court opinion? And then did your peer apply the rule to the facts? So really, this is just asking them if they did the things that the pattern says they're supposed to do. And then on the writing of the rule, the student has to assess whether their peer trimmed the rule, because those of you who are law trained will know that a legal rule often has a large number of disjunctive elements, for instance, many of which may not be applicable to a particular hypothetical situation. And for the reader, it's a lot of pain to have to read through all of that if it's not applicable. So we teach law students to trim some of that stuff away. And then some stylistic things, how they state the rule, and whether the students avoided attributive cues. And we'll come back to that in a minute when they state the rule. And then finally, did your peer state the rule as a prose sentence or paragraph rather than presenting it in bulleted items? Because students, especially coming out of undergraduate programs where most of their writing was doing PowerPoint slides, are prone to just do things in bullet points. And we don't encourage that in the legal curriculum. So this particular peer review really just asks them to do these two trait identification sets. Importantly, though, at the end, each student has to choose, I'm sorry about the airplane noise in the background, by the way. Each student has to choose at least one of the judgments they made about their peers' work and write a final comment about it. And in that final comment, they have to describe what they saw their peer do. They have to evaluate it by comparing it to what the textbook told them to do or what I said in the classroom. And then they have to suggest some kind of change or improvement. And it's this describe, evaluate, suggest pattern that forces students not just to practice the things that I'm telling them to do, but to be able to articulate them back to me and to their peers when it comes time to do peer evaluations.
And what strikes me about this review is that you have, I don't know what, 10 trait IDs, 10 yes, nos,
8
but
of them at least.
They only get to write 8. They only get to write about one thing. But Eli allows you to do contextual comments where they could leave as many comments as they wanted to, but you're restricting them to one. So what's that about?
I'm not restricting them to one, but I'm only requiring one. And for me, it's easier to use their final comments as a teacher if they're in the final comment place than if they're in the contextual comment place. And so I would just like them to write at least one. And as long as they write at least one, I'll be satisfied. If they wrote 4, that would be great. And there were, at least on this particular task this year, a couple students who'd write 2 or 3 for their peers, but they're not required to write more than 1. And this is especially important because this is the first, second week of the class. So I'm still getting them trained to do peer review at all. So I'm trying not to overwhelm them too much.
That's helpful. So how do you know that this works, right? What lets you know with your spidey sense as a teacher that this is working?
Well, I don't have any statistical data to show you, but I want to show you what I see as the teacher. So this is an example. This is how I saw the data that came out of this particular peer review, and I've anonymized the names out of this, so you're not seeing any students' names. But you get a list of tallied responses. So for every one of those checkboxes on a student's paper where they got a check from their peer, that tallied as a yes or as a 1, I guess you could say. And so you can come up with a percentage of who got what percentage of checks, right? So there are a few students here who got 100% of the checks. Their peers thought they had done all the things they were supposed to do. We've got many in the 90s range. We've got a few in the high 80s. And then we have a couple who are down here in the 37.5, 62.5 range. Here's the way it works. Here's the way I use it. During the class after this session, normally I would ask students to take a few moments to read the peer reviews they received, to look again at the peer reviews they gave, and to identify at least one useful insight they received from a peer, and at least one student the question has for me. Oftentimes the question will arise because different peers will give conflicting feedback. And I teach them that that's what they want to happen, because that's teaching them about the fact that different audiences will have different expectations for their work. And as a writer, they have to choose their way. They can't be governed by just one audience all the time. So we do that. Normally I would have them pair and talk about that before they share it out to the class. But during the COVID era, that's not been as easy as it used to be. So pairing, because we had face-to-face classes, so we weren't on Zoom every class. The students know that I can cold call them at this stage. So they take this preparation or thinking part seriously, because they know I may just ask them to say to the whole class, what did you find useful in your peer reviews, or what question do you have? And with these students who scored low, according to their peers on these characteristics, they're often the ones that I cold call. And that might seem like putting them on the spot, but actually what it usually results in is them saying, well, I realized after I looked at my peers' papers that I should have done something this way instead of the way I was doing it. Or the comments I got from my peers helped me understand that I needed to do it this other way. So it's an opportunity for the student to explain how they identified and made a repair in their own work. And sometimes if it seems like it would be particularly productive, I'll project one of those students' works on the screen and we'll talk through how they would fix it. And this is something that is a little bit different from many law school curricula. We spend a lot of time in my class looking at the screen at students writing. And they don't have experience of that ever having happened in their schooling before. They'll say frequently, I can't believe how much time we spend looking at our writing in the class, and I think that's really valuable. So that's what I use this part for, but let me show you the other part here that's important to me. If we get down to these trait identifications, on the CREAC components, you can see that the students pretty much thought they were all doing the CREAC components correctly. And that's pretty easy to do with this kind of assignment, it's so short. But when we get to the writing the rule part, you'll see that there are a couple of dips here. When it comes to whether your peer trimmed the rule, removing unnecessary disjunctive elements or extraneous material, or did your peer avoid attributive cues when stating the rule? Students didn't do as well on these things as they did on the others. And that's a signal for me before I begin that class that I want to spend some time focusing on those issues. So I'll identify a couple of student writing examples that we'll talk about during the class section. And I can say, well, here's student A and here's student B. Which one of these did a good job of avoiding attributive cues? And it draws attention in the students' minds to what counts as an attributive cue. And we talk a little bit more about why I don't like them. We talk a little bit more about how they can avoid them. And then we move on to talk about trimming the rule. Well, how are the different ways we could trim the rule? What disjunctive elements that aren't applicable here could we have left out of this rule statement? So I guess the sense, the way that I know it's working, I'll tell you the way I know it's working. I think this quality of the students' work is good, better than what I had seen before I was doing peer review. But of course, I have a bias. I'm doing this, so I want it to work, so I think it works. I don't know if it works or not that way. But I will tell you that the energy in our classroom discussions about writing, about the students writing, about their own writing, and about their peers' writing, is just something I don't usually see in any classroom. And so when I see it in my own classroom, it makes me feel good. It's exhausting at the end of a class session, but it makes me feel good because it means that they're engaging with their writing in the way that I'm going to be engaging it with it when I grade it.
Thank you so much for sharing, Brian. And I'll open the floor for questions. Anybody want to ask Brian anything about his assignment or his class?
I'll go ahead and ask. Actually, I have a couple of questions. One is, does this program integrate with your learning management system?
For me, I just link out to it. So we use Canvas. And so you can do a deep link to any activity in Eli Review right out of Canvas. So I set up an assignment in Canvas that has 3 points, let's say, for doing a writing task. That deep links out, and when I grade it, I do the speed grader on Canvas and just put the 3 points in for every student who did the assignment on time. And it works pretty slick in that way. I think there is a peer review capability in Canvas, but I haven't tried it because I know Eli Review and it works very well.
Canvas. We use Canvas and we tested out the peer review. Unfortunately, our faculty, they are not happy with that.
Well,
the reason being they want something to be done anonymously. Does this program do anonymous peer review?
Yes. So you have a choice. When you set up the peer review, you can make it so the students see whose papers they're reviewing, and you can make it so that they don't. I used to let them see, but I've been persuaded by others that there are some biases in the students that can influence the way they judge other students' writing. So at the evaluation stage, at this peer review stage, I now make them anonymous. But when we talk about their writing in class, I attribute authors to the works that we look at on the screen. And that's in part to as a kind of accountability measure so that students recognize their writing might be up there. And if they don't take care in how they put it together, they might not feel too proud of how it looks when it's up there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also add that we can do for real integration if your Canvas administrator allows such nonsense. It can be a challenge to get the paperwork done. The technical handshake is very fast and very simple, but the paperwork is a slog. But I'm your contact for that, and you can reach out to me at melissa@elireview.com and I will help you. But the off-the-shelf deep linking, which Brian is using for students, accomplishes the same thing. They just click and they're there.
It works pretty well.
I have a question with apologies if you said this, and I'm sorry, this has been a big Zoom day, so focus, always a problem.
Don't worry, Susan, it's all right.
Do you, I also teach LRW at Temple, and used Eli Review for the first time this semester. I did not use that final stage where the reviewed can respond to the reviewers on whether they found the review valuable. Do you use that, and was it worth anything?
Yes. Well, let me show you. Let me show you something quickly. It'll be easier for me to show you than to tell you.
Okay.
And I think I can get in fast enough. You'll all laugh at my slow technology navigation skills, probably. Let's see, where am I going to find the thing that I want? It's a page. And it always does this thing. Peer review. Advice and guidelines. Okay, so when I have the students do that thing at the next class session, the beginning of the class session, where they look at the peer review that they received, I tell them to use the 5-star system that Eli Review makes available to evaluate the peer review that they got. And I give them a rubric for that. And this is the rubric. You give your peer 1 star if the peer review they gave you was respectful, 1 if it described some aspect of your work, 1 if it evaluated your work according to a standard in the class, 1 if it made it a suggestion, and 1 if it knocked your socks off because it was a particularly valuable insight. And what I tell students is that they should be trying to make their peer reviews get at least 4 stars every time they give a peer review. If it gets 5 stars, that's fine. I'm not grading them based on these. But my pitch to them is, if you're getting 4 stars on the peer reviews you're giving, it means you're learning the material because you're helping your classmates learn the material. And students, law students, as you know, they love positive feedback. So they like getting the stars, and when they don't get them, we talk about that. And that's been an interesting and productive discussion. But I don't fold in. So if you're familiar at all with Peerceptive, which is another peer review tool that exists out there, wasn't designed specifically for writing, but there are some writing teachers who use it. The feedback you get as a reviewer actually affects your grade if you let the students grade each other. But I'm not letting students grade each other here. I'm just using it for the peer review.
I have a sort of related question. Hi, I apologize. I was also here late. I came in a little bit late. It's been one of those days. I also used Eli Review this past semester for the first time, and I was generally pretty pleased with it for all the reasons that you've said, and my students seemed to like it. At least they reported to me that they did. And I just thought I would mention on the anonymity, a couple of them specifically mentioned when I told them how I would have done this in an in-person class before, that they appreciated Eli Review and that it was anonymous, which it wouldn't have been if they were looking at each other face to face. But I had a couple of problems. Actually, what you're sharing now may solve some of that. So I'm going to ask if you might be willing to share your guidelines. The problems I had were mostly that the students were too nice in their reviews. They weren't as critical as I had hoped they might be in all components of it, the trait identification, the context comments, and even I did have them evaluate their reviews, and generally they just all gave everybody 5 stars. I had not given the guidelines first. And so that was one of the issues that I had. And the other was just with following directions. I thought that my directions were very clear each time, and I spent a lot of time preparing them. But for example, I would say, add 3 context comments in addition to the other kinds of comments, and some students only did 1. So I was wondering if you've encountered that and what kinds of things you've done to try and both have them really take it seriously and also follow directions.
Well, part of it is talking about it in class. I mean, if a student knows that you might ask them to explain the 4-star evaluation they gave to a peer review, it helps to keep them honest. And I think
true. I didn't bring it into the classroom as much, so that's a really good point.
I think bringing it into the classroom, in a sense, it becomes, and I know Bill Hart-Davidson uses this term, it becomes a writing workshop, not a writing class. And it's about getting them together, working together on their writing, not just listening to me, babble on about what my preferences are. So I think bringing it into the classroom makes them all feel a little bit more accountable, because they know what they've done is going to be up on the screen, where I'm going to say, hey, I see you gave a 2-star evaluation to one of your reviews. I'm going to pop that up on the screen on here. Where did you think it fell short? And so we actually talk about the reviews as a kind of writing that they have to be good at, in part because lawyers criticize each other's writing all the time. This is actually an important work skill for them, to be able to provide, respectful but useful critiques to each other on their writing. So I think you have to kind of work it in. I don't know if it'd be as effective if we didn't make it a focus of the class session. And that also depends on the amount of time. I mean, it takes me probably 45 minutes of class time to work through one of these workshops after a peer review. And if you have a 60-minute class session and you only have 2 of them a week, let's say, that might be too much of the time in your classroom. You might have to adapt the procedure a little bit. I've got 2 90-minute classes, and so doing this for 45 minutes is great, and then we shift to something else. And then we can kind of break up the class a little bit.
Brian, one of the questions that came through the chat from Susan Marie was about your choice to use a final comment rather than contextual comments, and how that actually plays out for you. How does it save you time or focus energy, or what problem does it solve for you?
I like the final comment because it's in the same place all the time. I mean, this will sound really stupid and simplistic, but when I get the peer review, I download the peer reviews into a spreadsheet, and I just read that column. And I don't read any of the students' writing, but I read all of the final comments. And that's my way of sort of knowing whether the students are doing what I want them to do or not. And that's, the few times I tried the contextual comments, that's just been more complicated. And so I just want them to put them at the end. And if I wanted them to write 3, as Ellie mentioned, you know, I would just have to write in big, bold letters in the instructions for that part, you must do this 3 times here. But they might still not listen to me, Ellie. I think that's just a, you know, that's a typical problem.
Yeah. Well, we have time for one more question on the recording at least. Anybody with a burning question?
Well, as I said, if there's anything, if you want a copy of these peer-reviewed guidelines that I use, or a link to the open access textbook, just let Melissa know, and she'll let me know, and we'll get it to you.
I'll be happy to do that. I'm going to stop the recording.